All right, welcome back to America Talks Live. I am joined now by Professor William Jacobson. He's professor of law at Cornell Law School. He's director of the Security Law Clinic for Cornell Law, and he's also founder of LegalInsurrection.com. Man, he's got all of these nice little Ivy qualifications, and then he wraps it up with legal insurrection. Professor, welcome. Great to have you on and being insurrective, if you will.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
You betcha. I've asked this question a couple of times today, but I haven't had this discussion with a lawyer yet. And I want to have this conversation because on May 3rd, Jim Comey appeared before the Senate in a Senate committee, and he told them when asked that nobody had ever interfered with any investigation he had carried on. They said, "Are you sure? Are you positive of that?" And he said, "I'm positive, because if they had done it, it would be a really big deal and I would remember it." Well, I think that's the end of the story until we're told he's going to testify next week on June 8th in open session in the morning, closed session in the afternoon. And now all of a sudden sources are telling us, whoa, no, he's going to fulfill everybody's fantasy and tell us that President Trump was interfering and demanding and threatening, and he wanted that investigation against Michael Flynn dropped. So, Professor, doesn't he have a little bit of a legal quandary here, or is this going to be parsed to the moon and back?
It's going to be parsed, and I'll tell you exactly how he's going to do it. And you're hearing it here first. If you go back and you read that Senate testimony or congressional testimony on May 3rd, and you look at what the question was, the question wasn't whether anybody had ever done it. The question was whether anyone from the Department of Justice had ever interfered or told him to stop the investigation. So he is going to say that the Department of Justice never did it, but Donald Trump did. And that's how he's going to get around that testimony. And that's my prediction. And nobody sees it coming except the people who are watching right now.
Yeah, boy, that will be fascinating if in fact he does it. But then again, for me, it raises another legal issue because he is a lawyer. He knows obstruction when he knows obstruction and when he sees it and when he encounters it. If he felt obstructed, if he felt like there was a problem, he went back to his office and made little notes and then did nothing about it. That puts him in a different kind of, not a legal quandary, but I would think an ethical quandary. And I may be making too many distinctions here. But if he saw and felt obstructed in February, why did he not say anything back then, sir?
That's right. And he testified in late March at a congressional hearing, and he said nothing about it whatsoever. And then he testified, as you indicated, in early May and was asked the question. And so is he really going to come in and essentially pull a Bill Clinton and argue over what the meaning of is? And he's going to say, well, when you asked me that question, whether anybody from Department of Justice had ever asked me to halt my investigation, I said no, but I didn't volunteer to you that the president had done it. That's just not very credible, but that is how that's the wiggle room he has if you want a literal interpretation and reading of the question asked and the question he answered. So I think it's a credibility issue. I don't think it's a legal issue. And I think he is probably primed to go. This is going to be his day in the spotlight. Oh, yeah. And I think he is going to unload to the extent he can. And to the extent Robert Mueller hasn't told him, don't go there, he's going to unload on Trump. Big league.
Bigly. He's going to bigly unload on the president. And what do you think the net effect is going to be?
I think it'll be a several-day news cycle. And I think it does depend how far Comey goes, because you're absolutely right. It's one thing to come in and say, we had this conversation, I felt uncomfortable, but I didn't view it in and of itself as a legal obstruction. And I think that's the important thing. Is he going to come in and say that he viewed it as a legal obstruction of his investigation? And if he does say that, the logical question is, well, why didn't you tell anybody about it? Why didn't you tell Congress when you testified in March? Why didn't you tell Congress when you testified in May? So I'm predicting he won't say it rose to the level of a legal obstruction, or he may defer on that and say, well, that's not my decision. I suspect that what he's going to say is, here's the conversations we had. I felt very uncomfortable about it. Therefore, I documented it in memos to the file.
This all bothers and troubles me tremendously. I feel like it's indicative of something else, and it actually leads into a piece that's, this is how my mind works. It's a weird tangent that we go off on here. You wrote a piece about what do conservative never Trumpers really want. And so it gets me to thinking, what do the Democrats really want here? Because if they manage somehow to create a case which Americans find believable for the impeachment of Trump, they are going to give the country a president they really are going to have a hard time reconciling themselves with. But conservatives would be out of their mind over the moon to get, and that would be Vice President Mike Pence. What's the end game here? What is going on in your estimation?
Well, I think the base, the so-called Democratic base, the people in the streets, the people shouting, want Trump out of office. They don't think beyond the next play. They're playing checkers, not chess. What I think the Democratic leadership wants, they want Trump in office in a completely paralyzed administration so that they can scandal-ridden, paralyzed administration so they can hopefully regain at least one House of Congress in 2018. If Trump is out of office, that doesn't really help them very much.
This is a political question, not a legal question, but I often wonder how much the country is buying this. I'm wondering to what extent the Democrats are starting to cut their nose off just to spite their face.
Well, if there ends up not being any scandal there, if there's no Russian collusion, if there's no illegality, if all the assertions of treason and traitors in the White House end up falling flat, this could backfire very significantly on the Democrats, because the economy is doing well. It seems to be accelerating. Trump is speaking with a lot of his policies, not necessarily to conservatives, but to populists, to working class people. I think the Democrats are in a very risky gamble here, but it's a risk they're willing to take because as of now, they are nowhere. They don't have either House of Congress. They don't have the presidency. They've lost most of the state governorships and legislatures. I think they're willing to take a risk, and they decided very early on the risk they're willing to take is to try to paralyze this administration.
We have 30 seconds. I have 30 seconds. I want to ask you something. What's a crime that's been committed or alleged to have been committed here?
I'm not sure there is. I think that we're getting into there. If there was collusion with the Russians, it's a bad thing, but it's not actually criminal.
Right.
There's nothing criminal about it. So the only criminality being alleged is obstruction of justice, that in response to a non-substantive media feeding frenzy, which sparked investigations, that the Trump administration or Trump himself somehow interfered with that. Yeah. It's a classic example of what we call process crimes, not underlying crimes.
All right, William, thank you so much. Appreciate you being here. Got to get you back on soon. Appreciate it. And remember,